This is the first part of GarageTalk, which is a new series of videos. In this part I'll be discussing some basic equipment which you'll find useful for maintaining your dirt bike. To work on your bike it's best if you have somewhere clean, dry and well lit. I use my garage and I keep the floor fairly clean. It's a concrete floor, and where I work on the bike I use a rubber mat. And then over the bike there's 4 fluorescent lights on the ceiling, and then over that way there's another 4, and even further over there's 2. And then on this wall over the bench there's a double fluorescent light. So I get good lighting on the bike. This is the rubber work mat I have. The size is 2 meters long, 1.4 meters wide and 4 millimeters thick, and it's pretty much the ideal size for working on a dirt bike. The great advantage of using a work mat like this is if you spill any fluids, oil or water while working on your bike, it's very easy to mop them up. If you're doing it directly on concrete, it soaks into the concrete and makes a real mess. Also, if you drop any parts, it's very easy to spot the parts on the rubber mat. And if it's a larger part, you might damage it if you dropped it directly onto concrete. A funny story I have is about 3 years ago, Lucas Matzinger, the KTM 690 round the world rider, while he was in Japan, he needed to overhaul his engine, and he used my garage for about a week or so. And when he was taking the engine out, he actually dropped it onto this mat. So the mark you can see in the middle of the picture is where Lucas dropped the engine onto the mat. Luckily the mat was there, otherwise if it dropped it directly on the concrete it might have cracked the cases and would have delayed his travelling somewhat. Here you can see the 3 stands I have. The stand at the front is a Ktm Lift Stand, so it has a pedal which raises the stand up. The stand in the middle is a lightweight aluminium stand. You need to lift the bike on to it, so it's a little more difficult to use. It does have a nice big platform, and the stand at the back is a hydraulic lift stand, which is great if you want to work on the engine. You can get the bike up nice and high so the engine is at a good level to work on without having to bend over. This is the KTM Lift Stand. I'm showing the bike across the mat. Normally I'd have it lengthways, but it's just easier to show the bike on the stand from this direction. As you can see, the rear wheel is about 10 centimeters off the ground and the front wheel is just touching the ground. If you want to take the front wheel off, you can do that easily enough, and the bike will sit on the stand with no front wheel, no problem. The lift stand is very easy to use and relatively lightweight, so it's easy to move around. Here you can see the aluminium stand, and the front wheel is off the ground about 1 centimeter and the rear about 5 centimeters. The stand has a relatively large platform area, so the bike is stable on it. And with a lightweight 2-stroke like my 250 XC, it's relatively easy lifting it up onto the stand. But if you have a significantly heavier bike, you probably don't want to use this. You'd be much better off with a lift stand. And here you can see the hydraulic lift stand. Both the front and rear wheels are about 30 centimeters off the ground. The engine is about waist height, which makes it very easy to work on if you're overhauling the engine. To raise the stand, because it's hydraulic, you use this pedal lever with your foot and pump it. It takes a little bit of time to pump it up to height, but it's not difficult. It just takes a bit longer than the other 2 stands. So I really only use it when I'm doing some major work on the bike. One disadvantage of the hydraulic stand is it's quite heavy and difficult to move around. So you can see here, one modification I made is to bolt on some wheels onto 2 of the legs on the sides. So when it's sitting like this on the ground, the wheels don't touch the ground. But you can grab the other legs, tip the stand up and then wheel it around quite easily. And if I was just going to get one stand, I'd get a lift stand like this. They're easy to use, simple and relatively inexpensive. When you're working on your bike, it's nice to have a bench. This is a steel bench I made myself, which I can also use for welding, which is why I have all the clamps attached to the wall. When I'm using it to work on the bike, I'll rest tools on there and also parts, so I'm not bending over, picking up tools and tripping over parts, so it's very useful. One really useful feature of the steel bench is when I'm not using it, I can easily fold it up onto the wall for storage. and it has a catch each side, and then the legs engage into the steel frame, and they're held in place just with a bolt each side. So you just take the nut off and then pull the bolt out and the leg comes out, and then you can store the legs easily. And just off the garage I have a separate bench area. The bench is about 275 centimeters long, and because of the size it's really nice for working on suspension forks. Below the bench you can see there's some tool chests for tool storage, and above there's lighting and also some cupboards for storage. Both my benches are 90 centimeters high, which is a good height for working at while standing. But if you have a stool like this, you can also sit down and use it easily. The long bench I left a gap in the middle, which you can see there, so I can sit down, put my legs underneath the bench and do things like soldering or cleaning tasks. And I also have another rubber mat by the long bench, which is really handy if I spill fork oil when I'm working on my suspension. It wipes straight up rather than soaking into the concrete. And at the end of the bench I've mounted a vise. This has 6-inch jaws, 15 centimeters. And the nice thing about this one, it opens up very wide. So it has about an 18 centimeter capacity. So you can hold some pretty large things in it. And I've bolted it to the bench so that the jaws overhang the edge of the bench. So I can hold for instance, a fork tube vertically without it touching the edge of the bench. And here you can see I've mounted a fork lower tube just to show the overhang. So there's about 2 centimeter clearance between the tube and the edge of the bench. And then I have a couple of different sets of soft jaws. The ones at the front are plastic ones, and good for holding things which are very easily damaged. And the ones at the back are aluminium ones, which I use most often. For electricity I have wall mounted outlets, and also up here I have a ceiling mounted reel, which is really handy for getting electricity close to the bike when I'm working on it. And then by the steel bench I have a wall mounted outlet which has 100 volts and also 200 volts for the welder. Having a compressed air source in your garage is handy for running air tools and also tire inflation. The one I have is 60 litres, which is a reasonable size one. And I haven't run into any issues, even running things like air grinders, it can still keep up with that. And just outside the garage I have a water tap. And then in a shelving unit I have a hose for washing the bike. At the end of the long bench I have a shelving system which I use for storing oil and parts. A lot of the small parts I keep in this drawer system here. And then in the cupboards above the long shelf I store various things like chemicals, oils, air filters, manuals, etc. This area of the garage is down the side of the car, and you can see I have a single bike hitch mounted carrier, 3-bike trailer stood up against the wall, and also a tire rack mounted to the wall. And depending on where you live and the climate, you might need heating or cooling. I find this fan works pretty well in the summer to keep me cool. I don't have any heating or air conditioning in the garage, but depending on where you live, you might find you need a heater or air conditioning. When I'm working on the bike, I like to have some background music, so I have this Bluetooth speaker and can play music from my phone or iPad. And a couple of safety items. It's always a good idea to have a fire extinguisher handy. And ventilation, if you're running the bike in the garage or using chemicals, or if you spilt gasoline, the way I do it is I partially open the garage door. I can fully open it if I need to, but be sure to have plenty of ventilation. And last but not least, you need a nice trash can. So this one I actually picked up at IKEA, and it's good because it has a lid on and it's a decent size, but not too huge to get in the way. But you definitely need some kind of trash can, and this one works pretty well in the garage. So that's it for part 1 of Garage Talk. In the next part I'll be talking about some basic tools which you'll need for working on your dirt bike.